You know how sometimes people say, "Oh, my family loves to joke around. They never take anything too seriously." And you kind of laugh along because, at the end of the day, you assume there are limits to what even the most mischievous family would consider funny. Well, I learned the hard way that for my family, those limits didn't exist. And the so-called joke they played on me one summer not only stripped me of whatever thin layer of trust I had left in them, but it also changed the entire trajectory of my life, because when someone abandons you and your 3-year-old child in a foreign country, a place where you don't know the language, don't have money, and don't have anyone to lean on, you stop thinking of it as humor and you start realizing it was cruelty dressed up as laughter, and what followed after that moment was both the darkest and, strangely enough, the most transformative period I've ever gone through. I remember the exact moment it all started. We were in the airport, all of us together, my parents, my siblings, their spouses, my little boy clutching my hand tightly because he was already overwhelmed by the noise and the bright lights, and me just trying to keep my nerves calm, because traveling with a toddler is never easy, and I had already rehearsed the whole trip in my mind. What snacks to bring, what games to play on the plane, how to handle the long layover. But nowhere in my mental checklist was there a section that said, "Prepare for the people you trust most in the world to vanish and leave you stranded." They were laughing that day, all of them, joking about who would sit where, making fun of how many bags I had packed because apparently bringing enough clothes and essentials for a child is over the top. And I remember feeling a little stung, but brushing it off, telling myself they didn't mean harm, that it was just their way. But as I look back now, I realized that even then there was a certain edge to their teasing, like they always wanted me to feel like the odd one out, like the overly cautious, overly emotional burden. I can't tell you how many times I thought about that during the weeks that followed. When I was trying to find food for my son with coins I scrounged from the bottom of my bag, or when I was trying to ask for directions in broken English mixed with desperate hand gestures, because that mocking laughter was the soundtrack playing in my head, the cruel reminder that they thought I was too weak to stand on my own. And yet here I was, forced to stand because I had no choice. The so-called joke happened fast. One moment I was stepping away to take my son to the restroom before boarding, and the next I came back to find our group missing, not just temporarily out of sight, but completely gone. Bags, tickets, everything. At first, I thought maybe they'd moved to another gate or gone to grab food, so I carried my sleepy boy and walked up and down the terminal, scanning every corner, expecting to see them wave me over. But after 20 minutes turned into an hour, dread started to crawl into my stomach. And when I went to the counter and asked about the flight, the agent told me, without any hesitation, that the rest of my party had already boarded and that the plane had left. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest, trying to make sense of what she just said, because it didn't compute. How could they board without me when they knew I had my child? How could they just leave? How could they not notice we weren't there? I tried to tell myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe they thought we'd already gone ahead, but deep down, even in that first moment, a voice inside me whispered the truth. That this wasn't an accident, this was deliberate, this was their idea of a prank. They thought I would panic for a few minutes, and then magically sort it out, and maybe, if I were alone, if it were just me, they might have been right. I might have swallowed my pride and stumbled my way through. But they didn't just abandon me, they abandoned my son, their own nephew, their own grandson, a little boy who didn't understand why suddenly everyone he knew had disappeared. He tugged on my sleeve and asked in the sweetest, smallest voice, "Mama, where's Grandma? Where's Uncle?" And I couldn't answer because I didn't know how to explain that the people he loved had treated us like disposable baggage. That moment broke something in me, but it also lit a fire because I knew I couldn't collapse, not in front of him, not when he needed me to be the one steady thing in a world that had just tilted off its axis. I took his hand, adjusted the straps of his tiny backpack, and told him we were going on an adventure, even though inside I was shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out. I had no plan, no safety net, no clue where to go, and almost no money, because I had trusted my family to handle the logistics and hadn't kept much cash on me. And yet in that terrifying, gut-wrenching moment, something inside me hardened. I decided I wasn't going to let their cruelty destroy me or scar my son, even if I had to crawl my way through each day one desperate step at a time. That was the beginning. The moment that set everything into motion, the moment where I stopped being the butt of their jokes and started becoming something else entirely. Someone they would never again dismiss so easily, because when they finally saw me again, months later, I was not the same broken, timid woman they had abandoned. I was someone who had rebuilt herself out of survival, and I carried with me a strength they couldn't laugh. When the reality of being left behind finally sank in, it wasn't like a thunderclap, not a sudden explosion of panic, but more like a cold wave creeping slowly up my spine until it wrapped around my throat and made it hard to breathe, because denial had been my shield in the first few hours. The stubborn hope that maybe I had misunderstood, maybe they were waiting at another terminal, maybe somehow they had arranged for me to catch another flight. But with every passing minute, that shield cracked and splintered until it was just me and the impossible truth I had been abandoned, deliberately, like an unwanted package forgotten at a station. And worse, my child had been discarded along with me. I couldn't stop replaying it in my head, over and over, searching for a moment where I might have missed something, a sign, a word, a warning, but there was nothing except their laughter echoing in my memory, that smug, careless laughter that told me they thought everything was a game. My son was hungry by then, his little legs dangling from the plastic chair as we sat near the empty gate, his eyes drooping with exhaustion, but still curious, still looking around as if he expected someone familiar to appear any second. And the sight of him trying to stay patient while his stomach growled nearly split me in two. I rummaged through my bag and found a crushed granola bar, the last snack I had, and broke it in half to share with him, forcing myself to smile, to pretend this was an adventure, a fun detour, when inside my mind was spinning with terror. Where would we sleep? How would we eat tomorrow? How could I possibly keep him safe in a country where I couldn't even read the signs on the walls? I tried to ask the airport staff if there was any way to contact my family, but when they checked the flight records, all they could tell me was that the rest of the group had checked in, boarded, and left as if it were the most normal thing in the world, as if leaving a daughter and grandchild behind was a detail too small to matter. The staff gave me a sympathetic look, but sympathy doesn't translate into food or shelter, and after pointing me toward an information desk, they moved on to the next passenger, leaving me to clutch my son's small hand with one of mine while holding tightly onto my bag with the other, because that bag was now all we had in the world. I could feel the weight of everyone else's eyes on me as they bustled past, travelers rushing to their own destinations, families sticking together, couples bickering over tickets, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, and in that endless sea of motion, I felt like a ghost, someone who didn't belong anywhere, someone stranded between two worlds with no place to land. My boy tugged at me again and asked if we were going to see Grandma tomorrow, and I lied through my teeth, told him yes. Because what else could I say? That Grandma had chosen to leave him, that Uncle thought it was funny to watch a struggle, that none of them had looked back. My heart burned with a mix of rage and despair, but I swallowed it down, kissed the top of his messy hair, and said, yes, tomorrow, knowing full well tomorrow would bring no such reunion. That night, I learned how cruel the world can feel when you have no safety net, because airports are not designed for people like me, people with nowhere to go and no ticket home. And as I paced the sterile halls with my son asleep against my shoulder, I realized that my survival instinct was the only thing standing between him and disaster, and that no matter how weak or scared I felt, I had no choice but to find a way through. It's strange how quickly the body learns to adapt when there is no other choice, how survival stops being some dramatic concept and becomes a series of small, almost mechanical decisions you make just to get through the next hour, the next night, the next day. And that was what happened to me after the crushing realization that my family had left me and my child in a foreign land without warning, without money, without even the decency of a message. At first, I clung to denial, replaying the scene in my mind as though I might wake up and discover it had all been a nightmare. But every time I opened my eyes to the harsh fluorescent lights of the airport, every time my son stirred in his sleep beside me on the cold bench where we had curled up together, reality came back sharper and more unforgiving than before. Hunger gnawed at us constantly. The few coins I had bought us bottled water and one small sandwich, which I divided as evenly as possible, pretending it was a game, telling him we were explorers rationing food on a great expedition. He smiled, though weakly, and in that moment his trust in me was like a knife and a balm at the same time. Painful because I knew how fragile our situation was, but healing because it reminded me that I still had something worth fighting for, that I couldn't crumble no matter how much I wanted to. Days blurred together in the airport before I finally worked up the courage to step outside into a city I didn't know, carrying my son on one hip and our bag over the other shoulder, squinting into the brightness of streets, filled with sounds I couldn't decipher, languages that tangled in my ears until they were nothing but noise. I felt like a ghost walking among the living, invisible and vulnerable all at once, terrified of every stranger yet dependent on their mercy. We wandered aimlessly at first, my son asking questions I couldn't answer, pointing at shops and people, until exhaustion dragged us into a small park where he could at least run a little while I tried to think. I remember sitting on a splintered bench, watching him chase pigeons with the kind of innocent delight that only a child can still manage in the midst of disaster, and I thought about how reckless my family had been to assume I couldn't cope without them, how their joke was really a test they thought I would fail, a test that might have destroyed me if I hadn't had that little boy as my anchor. Every plan I made from that moment revolved around him, finding food, finding shelter, keeping him safe, keeping him from seeing the fear etched into every line of my face. The first nights outside the airport were the hardest, because the city turned hostile after dark. Shadows lengthened and men's eyes lingered too long, and I clutched my son against me like a shield, whispering stories into his ear to drown out the pounding of my own heart. I learned quickly that desperation teaches you humility. I begged for leftover bread at bakery doors. I asked shopkeepers if they knew of cheap hostels. I even stooped to rifling through trash bins when no one was looking, ashamed but unwilling to let shame starve my child. In those moments, my family's laughter echoed in my head louder than ever, fueling me with a mixture of rage and sorrow, because every scrap I scavenged, every cold night we endured, was proof of the cruelty they had inflicted for the sake of amusement. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the humiliation, something inside me hardened like steel, a quiet determination that grew stronger each day, whispering that if I could endure this, if I could guide us through the storm without breaking, then one day they would see me not as the weak one, not as the punchline of their cruel jokes, but as someone who had survived what none of them could have imagined. There comes a point in every ordeal where fear stops being a screaming voice in your head and instead becomes a low, constant hum that follows you everywhere, like background music you can't turn off, and for me that shift happened during those first weeks after being abandoned, when I finally realized no one was coming back for us, no miracle was waiting just around the corner, no parent or sibling would appear with outstretched arms, pretending it was all just a silly misunderstanding. At first, I had clung to that fantasy because it was easier than facing the truth, but as days stretched into weeks, and every morning I woke with my son curled against me on a hard mattress in some cramped shelter, or on worse nights, on a park bench with my jacket wrapped around him, the fantasy dissolved until only the raw ache of betrayal remained. The routines of survival became strangely familiar, finding food through a patchwork of kindness, charity, and desperation. Keeping my child entertained with stories spun from thin air so he wouldn't dwell on the hunger gnawing at his belly. Navigating streets that grew a little less alien with each passing day, and though my body felt like it was crumbling under exhaustion, my spirit refused to break, almost out of spite. The hardest part wasn't even the hunger or the cold, though those were brutal enough, but the silence from my family, the absolute void of messages, calls, or even a whisper of concern. I had managed to borrow a phone once at a community center, fingers trembling as I typed out message after message, my heart hammering as I called numbers that rang endlessly into nothing. But no reply ever came. It was like we had been erased, like we had ceased to exist for them. And I would lie awake at night wondering what story they told others. Did they laugh and say I chickened out of the trip? That I couldn't handle traveling with a child? That I had wandered off irresponsibly? The not knowing was its own kind of torment, but I refused to let it consume me, because I couldn't afford to waste my strength on questions without answers. My boy became my compass, and each day I asked myself only one thing: how do I make sure he survives this with me? I learned to trade favors, to accept help even when pride screamed against it, to wash our clothes in bathroom sinks and hang them to dry under the weak sun, while pretending it was all part of some grand adventure. To him, I tried to make the world feel safe, even when danger lurked in every shadow, even when my heart raced at the thought of what might happen if we slipped one rung lower on the fragile ladder we were climbing. And yet, in that furnace of fear and necessity, something unexpected was forged. A strength I never knew I had, a voice that stopped apologizing for existing, a resolve that grew harder and sharper every time life tried to grind me down. People often assume that betrayal is a sharp, singular wound, something you feel in one violent burst before the pain slowly fades. But what I discovered in those endless weeks was that betrayal can be a living thing, a shadow that stretches itself into every moment, weaving through your thoughts and pressing down on your chest when you least expect it. And the longer it lingers, the heavier it becomes until it threatens to suffocate you. That was how I lived in those days, carrying betrayal like an invisible weight, one I couldn't set down even when exhaustion made my arms tremble and hunger gnawed at the edges of my patience. But I carried it because I had no choice. Every time I looked at my son's round cheeks, or listened to his questions about when we would see grandma and uncle again, the wound deepened. Because he didn't know, he couldn't know, that the people who were supposed to love him the most had abandoned him alongside me. I remember one evening in particular, when we were sitting on the steps of a church that sometimes gave out warm meals, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. My boy's eyes lit up at the smell, and though we had already eaten our fill of soup and bread that night, he asked if we could have chestnuts too. I shook my head gently, telling him maybe another day, and he didn't cry or complain, just nodded and leaned against me with the kind of quiet acceptance that both broke my heart and fueled my determination. It was in moments like that I realized how resilient children could be, how they adapt when forced to, but also how deeply they trust the person they depend on, and that trust became my driving force. I swore to myself that no matter how cruelly I had been discarded, I would not let my child feel abandoned by me, not for a second. I would be his constant, even if I had to bleed for it. At night, when he finally drifted off in my arms, I would stare at the ceiling of whatever shelter we found or the stars above us in the open air, and my mind would spiral into thoughts about my family, trying to decipher their reasoning. Did they truly think it was funny? Did they sit together at dinners and laugh about me, about how frantic I must have been, how lost, how desperate? The thought of them chuckling at my pain sent waves of nausea rolling through me, but it also fanned the flames of something stronger than anger, resolve. I began to imagine a future where I wasn't just surviving but thriving, where I could look them in the eye one day and let them see what their betrayal had created, not the weak, timid woman they had mocked, but someone who had crawled through hell and come out the other side still standing. When the weeks of scrambling turned into months, something inside me shifted in a way that was almost frightening, as though the version of myself that had existed before. The daughter who bit her tongue when her family mocked her, the sister who always agreed to keep the peace, the woman who second guessed every decision she made, had been burned away by hunger, exhaustion, and necessity, leaving behind someone sharper, someone harder, someone who no longer cared about being liked or accepted, because survival had carved out the luxury of caring what others thought. It's strange to describe, but I began to feel an almost eerie clarity during those days, as if each challenge that should have broken me instead chiseled away the softness my family used to ridicule, revealing steel beneath that even I didn't know was there. The more I endured, the more I began to believe that their cruel joke had backfired, that by abandoning me in a foreign country, they had accidentally set me free from them, and as painful as that freedom was, it also filled me with a sense of control I had never felt before. My son grew alongside me in this crucible of survival. He learned to be patient, to appreciate small joys, to find comfort in the simplest things, like a piece of fruit shared between us or a blanket donated at the shelter. Watching him adapt made me realize how much children absorb from their parents. And I knew I had to show him not despair but resilience, not weakness but strength, even when I was trembling inside. I started taking odd jobs, cleaning, washing dishes, even sweeping streets when someone offered me a broom and a few coins, anything to buy us a little more food, a slightly warmer place to sleep. Each coin I earned felt like a victory, proof that I was not helpless, proof that I could carve out a life even in the shadow of betrayal. There were nights when I lay awake, muscles aching from work, mind replaying every cruel smirk, every dismissive word from my family, and instead of crumbling under those memories, I used them like fuel, promising myself that when they finally laid eyes on me again, they would not recognize the woman standing before them. They would expect to see the fragile girl they had mocked, the one who cried too easily, who relied on them too much, but instead they would face the woman who had crossed fire with a child on her hip and come out unscathed. That vision kept me going, a silent promise whispered to myself each morning when I woke and pulled on the same worn clothes, ready to fight another day. When the day finally came that I stood face to face with my family again, it was almost surreal, as if the months of hunger, fear, and quiet victories had been building toward this single collision, a moment that felt both inevitable and unthinkable at the same time. And the strangest part of all was how ordinary it looked on the surface. They were gathered in a cafe, laughing loudly as though the world had never changed, as though they hadn't ripped mine apart with their cruelty, and when I walked in with my son holding my hand, their laughter faltered for the first time in my memory, replaced by something between disbelief and discomfort. I could see it written all over their faces. They had expected me to vanish, to crawl back broken, to maybe send a tearful message begging for forgiveness. But they had not expected me to return like this, standing tall, thinner and more tired than before, yes, but with a steadiness in my eyes that they could not erase with ridicule. My son clung to me, wary of the familiar strangers who had once been his safe place, and I felt his tiny fingers grip tighter as though he knew instinctively that we were walking into a lion's den. No words came at first. Silence filled the space like smoke, choking and heavy, until finally my mother stammered my name, half rising from her chair as if she couldn't believe her eyes. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't cry. I simply stood there and let them look at me, let them absorb the reality that their abandoned daughter and grandson had not only survived but returned on their own terms. It was a moment of quiet triumph, the kind that doesn't need fireworks or applause, just the raw, undeniable proof of existence. They tried to speak, to cover their unease with jokes and nervous chatter, but every word sounded hollow to me, like echoes bouncing off walls that no longer held any meaning. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need their approval, their validation, or even their understanding. I had already walked through the fire, and their opinions could no longer burn me.